Even when the title of the conference is Andalusian Music as a cultural bridge between Spain and Maghreb, between Spain and Morocco, we can extend this concept to the whole Maghreb, because the Andalusian music is a music that was born in Spain during between the cycles 9 and 15, but was exported to the Maghreb due to the migration, the expulsions of Muslims in 1492, and has been developed in this whole area of the Maghreb during the last centuries. The role of music as a means of intercultural dialogue has been raised on a numerous occasions throughout history. Like painting and dance, music is a universal language that, in spite of its ties to strong cultural elements, knows no bounds. In addition, the music, thanks to the technology, enjoys a moment only comparable to the revolution that led with the advent of sound recording in the late 19th century. Recent years have opened a new path for mankind in the field of communication, unknown to date. While this has a number of drawbacks, we must admit that the dissemination of culture is experiencing an unprecedented moment in which the interested listener with access to the proper technologies can hear any music at any time without borders or distances. From Spain, Arabic music is viewed so close. The historical past of the Iberian Peninsula is dotted with settlements of different peoples that have left a series of cultural layers of different durations. One of them, and possibly the most important, is the Islamic culture. The Muslim culture remained for nearly 8 centuries on the Iberian Peninsula. Their presence left behind a permanent mark on many cultural aspects in our country. The Andalusians expelled were forced to leave behind many of their properties. However, nobody could get into their thinking of their immaterial heritage. Thus, the legacy of the Andalusian music has been kept and developed in the Maghreb, appearing today as a unique bridge of communication between the Spain that saw its birth and the countries where this art has been further developed. In the Iberian Peninsula, not only can we talk about music as a vehicle for dialogue, music is the actual result of this dialogue. In Al-Andalus, the foundation for an enormous cultural heritage was created, and it will be developed over centuries as a result of a coexistence. No one can hide the difficulties that this coexistence suffered over almost 8 centuries. However, there are also many examples of long peaceful neighborhood during that period. The fruit of the music created on that years is still on its way, ever evolving. Thus, the Andalusian that were expelled carries their enormous cultural heritage that they have developed on the peninsula with them, and once they established themselves in the different countries of the Maghreb, carries and developed until today. In literature, the mark that was left of poetic and musical structures represents significant proof of their status as an intercultural receptor. The poetry form called the muashaha are the most obvious sign of this dialogue because their texts join both Arab and Jewish terminology together with the Castilian of that time. The publication of the Mozarabic muashahas, including the mixed harchas by the Professor Samuel Stern in the journal Al-Andalus in 1948, revolutionized the field in the mid-20th century. This highlighted what many philological researchers have already supposed. The Andalusian managed an intermediate language between Arabic, Hebrew, and Castilian that allowed them to communicate not only in everyday life, but in this artistic manifestation. A parallel situation in music is undoubtable. Without going into great detail on a well-known subject, I would like to point out that the trace of this situation can be perceived in the shared roots of common rhythms still used today. As a brief example, we have those of Morocco and Zamora on those of Tunisia and Aragon. The 6/8 rhythm so prevalent in the Maghreb with the accent on the second part of a beat. This rhythm is like this rhythm is 100% equal to the Salamanca's brincaos, traditional music of our region of central Spain bordering Portugal. Also, in Tunisia we find popular songs enormously similar to those jotas that exist all over the Iberian Peninsula. In mixed musical ensembles, Maghrebian and Spanish, we have often played melodies from both sides without even changing one of the accents found in these common rhythms. All this led us to think of a deeply rooted legacy that has remained as strong as the Andalusian architecture that today identifies the Arab world in our country. La Alhambra, la Mezquita de Córdoba, etc. Perhaps this is one of the reasons justifying our fascination with the Arab culture. Specifically, music has always exercised on the Spanish public. In the creative field are numerous examples ranging from Eastern reminiscent of the genre called la copla, one of whose rhythms are called sambra, with hundreds of artists from the ranking of Concha Piquer to the many authors whom have been just as prolific as the Maestro Quiroga, or to classical composers on the Spanish Orientalist movement. Here, this movement, Orientalist, in the case of many Spanish authors, curiously fused its shapes with that other name, nationalism, with used traditional music as a sort of inspiration. To name just a few composers, we have Isaac Albéniz, Enrique Granados, José Turina, Ángel Barrios, and in some respect, the universal Manuel de Falla. They have all shown Eastern musical influence in their work, identify them surprisingly as a sign of Hispanic identity. It is also remarkable as an Orientalist composer the presence of a not very well-known author called Fernando Gravina, who in 1931 won first prize in the International Oriental Music Competition of Alexandria in Egypt for his composition A una danzarina egipcia. Our cultural proximity to the Arab world means that within this current Orientalist arises even a more specialized movement which become known as the alambrismo. The Diccionario de la Música Española Hispanoamericana, published in 1999, indicates that the term alambrismo is confined to a cultural phenomenon or aesthetic fashion that emerged in Romantic Europe in the 19th century, and it was applied to music. We could say that this movement brings together a number of works rather than a number of authors. We find exponents of the alambrismo, both in the zarzuela as symphonic music. Zarzuela are Spanish operettas popular in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, through song and chamber music. Leaving aside what might be called Spanish Orientalist, among the alambristas' composition should be noted La Fantasía Morisca by Ruperto Chapí, En la Alhambra by Tomás Bretón, Adiós a la Alhambra by Jesús de Monasterio, La Rapsodia Andaluza by Joaquín Ocón, The Suite Morisca by Isaac Albéniz, and of course, Recuerdos de la Alhambra de Francisco Tárrega. To understand the international scope of the alambrismo movement, it's more than enough to note that two works of Claude Debussy are often ascribed to it. The second piece in his stamps, Soirée d'Engrenade, and one of his preludes, La Porte du Vin. But speaking of influence, it should be noted that these examples often appear more only as a sort of thematic inspiration or aesthetic exercise than a serious approach to musical modes, scales, or Arabic rhythms themselves. As examples, there are numerous zarzuelas inspired by the atmosphere of the Middle East in the development of their plots. in which the so-called the others look, it's more subjective than ever. However, it should be noted that in the case of Spain, the influence of this music has always been a subject of study since the presence of Islam in the peninsula, unlike other European countries, was obviously something more than an aesthetic trend. Thus, musicologists such Julián Rivera y Tarragó in the early 20th century maintained the strong presence of Arab elements in our medieval codex, as seen in Las Cantigas de Alfonso X el Sabio. They do not only speak of the influence in medieval Hispanic areas for obvious social and historical reasons, but how this influence extends to the work of composer. His deep but always controversial investigation led him to say that we should thank to the Moors in Andalusia, those which had the virtue to maintain and even to generously communicate an excellent rich musical background, which constituted a perennial source for European composers who wanted to renew their inspiration. Logically, not all of Rivera's contemporaries share his point of view, and criticisms emerged strongly rejecting his theories. His point of view have always been surrounded by controversy, but recent times have proved that he was right in some issues that once seemed closer to imagination than to a scientific rigor. Many of those opposed to the current Arabist research undertaken by Rivera have overlooked such obvious factor as the presence of Arab instruments in the Spanish medieval Christian iconography. This iconography clearly showed that the instruments of Andalusian music left his mark on Spanish medieval music. Its presence is felt not only in the influence exerted on parallel developed instruments, but in the use of the very same ones. This is the case of the Andalusian or Maghrebian rabab, used today in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunis, and it's identically represented in Spanish medieval iconography. In the 13th century at the Cantigas de Alfonso X el Sabio, or in the 14th century at the famous Relicario del Monasterio de Piedra in Aragon. Just to name two well-known examples. Let me stress that we are not talking about instruments that are similar. We are talking about ones that are identical. Has not been any changes during 700 years. As for the reconstruction of medieval Spanish music, it has been absolutely necessary to search for the performance techniques for some of these instruments. It can be said that without the actual presence of these instruments in the Andalusian tradition, it would have been nearly impossible to recover these techniques to play these medieval instruments. It is essential to mention that the growing interest aroused by Andalusian music in our country during the last decades. Since the publication in the early 60s of the disc by Atrium Musicae, Monodía Cortesana Medieval y Música Arábigo-Andaluza, with the collaboration of the Abdesadab Ishkara Orchestra from Morocco, there have been many Spanish interpreters who have become interested in this musical heritage, not only from the point of view of historical contribution, but for a contemporary vision, as the works of Juan Peña Lebrijano, to give just one example. Thus, in recent years, in Spain and Europe, record labels dedicated to publishing and to the dissemination of Andalusian music in the West have emerged, even though the current situation of the record business makes them feel dangerously uneasy. On the other hand, in the 29th edition of the Festival de la Guitarra de Córdoba in 2009, one of the world's most prestigious events of its kind, a course for beginners and listening to Andalusian music was open for enrollment. Within only a few days, students so eagerly signed up that the course was full, making it a real success. The interest of those who attended this course were laying in all respects of Andalusian music: history, structures, schools, tools, scale, techniques. Because of this growing interest, many groups have appeared made up of young performers looking to learn the melodies and structure of this precious legacy. Before finishing and getting into the topic of the intrinsic values of the Andalusian music and the benefits that they can bring to a cultural dialogue, it is necessary to be stressed the importance of oral tradition. Traditional music, those who live in the aforementioned oral heritage, has a major communication capabilities. Perhaps this is due to its enormous potential for selection. The oral tradition is the largest existing screening. That music which connects with the audience roots itself and it's perpetual. What doesn't not reach the heart of a listener disappears naturally and irreversibly. This patrimonial system, which did not use written notation until recently, not only brings benefits in terms of memory exercise forced onto the musicians, but also in that their learning is closely linked to the figure of a teacher, with what is learned to assess the elements of respect and really appreciate the experience. In Andalusian music, the musician of several generations plays and lives together, since without such coexistence it's impossible to communicate and learn. And the interpretation of Andalusian music is developed individually, but as a team, and with a huge degree of freedom, but without abandoning the rules that characterize it. These are values that this genre has treasured for centuries, and its contribution to the world in which we live today is of great use to new generations. Attendance to concerts of Andalusian orchestras transport us to another time, and we are thrilled to recognize them as a treasure, not only musical but human. We are well aware that music is not the only vehicle for dialogue between different nations or cultures, frequently driven by different interests. But there are interesting examples, as this example known by everyone, which is the West Eastern Divans Orchestra. In 1999, Daniel Barenboim and Edward Said founded the West Eastern Divan as a workshop for Israeli, Palestinian, and other Arab musicians. In his own words, they materialized a hope to replace ignorance with education, knowledge, and understanding, to humanize the other, to imagine a better future. 3 years after its founding, the orchestra was given a home in Seville by the regional Spanish government of Andalusia. They show to the world that music can sometimes reach positive objectives. There, where the diplomats, traders, and military has been failed for decades. With the music, the opposite parts in conflict share an art space during a couple of hours and sit down together not to fight, but to share one of the most elevated manifestations of the human beings, the art of music. Well, we can say that there is two market fields, okay? The natural field, which is the Maghreb countries, that the people on the street have not the consciousness of the origin of the music that they just sing or play. So it's part of your culture, it's part of your life. You have been listening to your grandfather, your father, your mother, your grandmother. So they don't go behind of that, you know. But in the foreigner countries, when you arrive with this music and you talk about the origin of this music, many people realize that if you see one of the Arabic monuments architecturally, you are just seeing, but you can listen as well the music that is inside of these monuments. So it's a great value. It's a great value because the people not only see and not only can stay in the place, but it can feel more or less the emotion that people felt 1,000 years ago. And people likes to investigate more on that. There is always question. When we make concerts, always question. The people want to know how and want to know the lyrics and want to know everything, you know. There is what we call harchas is part of the muashahas, and the muashaha is there. But everyone in Spain, everyone who has studied anything about philology, have heard about the harchas, because the harcha is a philological phenomenon, right? But the harcha is inside the muashaha, which is a biggest poetic form, right? That englobe everything. And they sing muashahas. They sing muashahas. Perdón por mi inglés. No, está. Actually, we have personally the experience of this, because we travel to Algeria, to Tunis, to Morocco, in order to learn their music. But the final result is that we learn their music and they learn our music. And finally, we used to make international ensembles that everyone play everything. So this is where we found common rhythms, common scales, common modes. And when we play together, we found that they are not that long, that distance. So, especially with the Andalusian music from Spain, has been developed a very deep work to let a third kind of countries to know this common heritage, okay? Because maybe from the Maghreb countries, they don't have the diplomacy structures to articulate tours for his artists, but they do through the Spanish structures, okay? And we, the Spanish musician, become some kind of ambassadors that introduce the Maghreb music in other countries, and they introduce us in the Maghreb countries. So it's a fluent current. Es una magnífica pregunta. Why this similitude between the Andalusian music and the Indian music? Well, there is a immigration current. There is many investigators that say that flamenco music becomes from Arabic music. I'm not agree at all. I'm not agree, because there is not one common rhythm between these two cultures, but there is many common rhythms and scales between flamenco and Rajasthan music, no? Because the gypsies from Rajasthan come through the Maghreb. They traveled through the Maghreb and arrived to the Peninsula Iberica, and they left many of his rhythm, many of his way to sing, and which is maybe more important, his way to express, his way to stay in the stage. You know, I don't know if I answer your question. Te la digo en castellano, ¿me entendiste? ¿Te lo digo en castellano? No, más o menos. Bueno, nos decía que hay mucha gente que establece las raíces del flamenco en la música árabe. Yo no estoy de acuerdo en lo absoluto, porque no hay ni un solo ritmo, ni una sola escala, no hay formas musicales comunes. Sin embargo, sí hay entre el flamenco y los gitanos del Rajasthan. Hay una corriente migratoria demostrada de los gitanos del Rajasthan que vienen por el Magreb, Egipto, el Magreb, a la península ibérica. Y van dejando todas esas influencias. De forma que hoy encontramos muchas de esas cosas en el folclore de Rajasthan y en cosas incluso en la península ibérica, no solo ya en las escalas, sino en la forma de expresarse y en la forma de estar en el escenario. No es lo mismo la actitud de un cantante de fado que la actitud de un cantante de heavy metal, obviamente. Entonces, en ese tipo de cosas se encuentran muchas raíces comunes, ¿no? Entre la música del Rajasthan y mucha música del flamenco y algunas cosas de la música andalusí. Hay que pensar que el Magreb y la península ibérica, the Maghreb and the Iberian Peninsula, has been a common territory with the capital sometimes in la peninsula or sometimes in Marrakech. Marrakech was the capital of Al-Andalus, even almost to the Pyrenees. So we have a common territory and we have a common culture as well during a long period of time. If you take from the very beginning to the very end, are almost 8 centuries that we cannot avoid in any way. And there is a very important that you mentioned it, element, which are the Jews or Judíos. The Jews in the Maghreb were, how can I say, they are intermediaries between everything because they manage the business. So they have friends in everywhere. They have contacts in everywhere. And the Jews always take, I can show you a video of a Jew singing Andalusian music in Hebraic. Yeah? Actually it's a Rabino, Haim Luke, a Rabbi, singing Andalusian music, and he sings first in Arabic with every Moroccan clapping, and then he sings in Hebraic, and everybody clapped as well. Because Morocco has been one of the not many Arabic countries that still has a good relationship with the Jews, and even with members in the government and everything. So this same situation was in the medieval Peninsula Iberica times. But all this is a very complex situation that need to speak very deep